Well, good afternoon, everybody, to the Corporate Knights web panel on natural solutions to the climate crisis. I am not Toby Heaps. My name is Ralph Torrie. I'm the Director of Research for Corporate Knights, and I'm standing in for Toby today, who had to attend to some urgent family business. We're going to be having a conversation today that has been stimulated by a remarkable report that was recently put out by Nature United, the result of a 3-year collaboration, which you'll be hearing more about from Amanda Reed in a moment. And then we're going to have 3 very distinguished panelists address the issues raised in that report, with a particular focus on the implications to business of how we can implement the many solutions that are in that report, and what is the business strategy and the business model for getting these mitigation opportunities deployed over the next 10 years in order to make the contribution that they're able to make to our climate change response. So I'm going to hand it over to Amanda Reed now, who is with Nature United, the organization that made all of this happen. She's the Director of Strategic Partnerships there and has a varied background, which includes an MBA from Georgetown University and studies in religion and Latin and a lot of other things. So just the kind of multidisciplinary mind which would come up with the idea for such an interesting collaboration. And she's going to tell us a little bit more about the report, and then we'll introduce the panel. Amanda?
Thank you very much for the introduction and for being here today. It's really great to have this event right on the heels of publication, which just happened over the weekend, last weekend. So I will share my screen. I'm sure you can all see the presentation now at this point. So yeah, we're really excited to be here, not only giving you a bit of an overview into the study and what the science says about the potential for natural climate solutions in Canada, but also to have these great panelists who can talk about what it actually really means for the private sector to engage in accelerating these natural climate solutions and how to deploy them at scale in Canada. So always good to start with a little bit of definition and what we mean by natural climate solutions. So what this study really did is it looked at actions to protect, better manage, and restore forests, grasslands, wetlands, and agricultural lands with a specific intent of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, either through avoiding emissions that are imminent or sequestering greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. Natural climate solutions, which we'll show you through the study results, have a great potential to reduce emissions, but we are always very careful to point out that they have to be done as part of a larger framework to reduce fossil fuel use, increase energy efficiency, and innovations in the transportation and building sectors. The idea for this study was really based off of our global affiliate, who 3 years ago looked at these natural climate solutions across the world and found that 1/3 of the Paris Agreement commitments at that time could be met through natural climate solutions. So they have a very, very important role to play, both in meeting 2030 targets as well as 2050 targets. But again, they must be part of that larger energy transition. What's really important for Canada, when we think about these natural climate solutions, they provide a lot of co-benefits for people and nature. So they provide a lot of environmental benefits. Better protecting and managing nature will also protect water sources for people, protect habitat for biodiversity, increase soil health. They provide a lot of economic opportunities, supporting jobs in the near term, providing new and alternative revenue streams, and new local economies based on intact lands. Also, a lot of social benefits, whether it's reduced risk from natural disasters or protecting cultural resources. Also, we're very careful to point out that all natural climate solutions, because they really are about changes in the way that we relate to land, and the majority of the potential of natural climate solutions in Canada fall on the traditional territories of Indigenous people. It's critical that anytime governments or corporates or NGOs are thinking about how they're going to go about advancing natural climate solutions, that those programs are designed in a way that respects Indigenous rights and also allows the space for Indigenous leadership to implement these solutions and enjoy the benefits from them. When we go into the study, one of the things that we were careful about was not to overestimate the potential for natural climate solutions. We wanted to create very real, conservative numbers that decision makers could make their investment decisions based on. And we also didn't want to be promoting new natural climate solutions that would cause different problems for local economies and local livelihoods. So we put a lot of safeguards and discounts on the projections that we came up with the study. So for example, biodiversity safeguards. We're not saying raise the land and plant monoculture plantations for bioenergy. We only reduce logging by 10% so as not to disproportionately affect forestry-based economies and local communities. We're not taking any high quality ag lands out of food production. So we tried really hard to ensure that we weren't overly impacting local economies by promoting these natural climate solutions. So with that context, we embarked on this research initiative. There's 38 co-authors on the study. These are the 16 institutions that contributed to it. We had a great mix of government agencies, universities, as well as some NGOs and private consultants. After 3 years of research, the overall headline from the study is that in the year 2030, these 24 pathways that we looked at, which I'll show you in a second, can reduce emissions by 78 megatons annually. So this is an annual number in the year 2030 from actions that are implemented between 2021 and 2030. And this number is equivalent to powering the emissions from powering every home in Canada for 3 years. So it's a pretty big number when you put it into context. It's also about equal to 11% of all of Canada's current level of emissions. So I always like to flash up this figure. This is like the quintessential figure of the report. It's obviously very hard to see on a webinar like this, but when you go and download the report, you can pick it apart. But what I really want to show you on this slide is these pathways we looked at. So we looked at these 24 pathways. They were grouped into agricultural lands, wetlands, grasslands, and forests with specific actions in each of those buckets. So the study estimates the mitigation potential from these very specific actions, like increasing cover crops, pre and post cash crop, and nutrient management through the 4R fertilizer management system. It also estimates the cost of this mitigation potential into 4 buckets. So as low as less than $10 a ton up to over $100 a ton. And so you can see in the sort of aggregate buckets, the agricultural pathways represent almost half of the overall potential. And a lot of that potential is coming in at less than $100 a ton. The colored bars are the co-benefits, so those things that I talked about. And so this isn't quantified in the study, but it is qualified. And there's an analysis of how these pathways contribute to these co-benefits for air, biodiversity, soil, water, and social. So here's another and easier way to look at the study, broken down by those major land types. So agricultural lands are providing almost half of the overall potential, with some of the key pathways being cover crops, biochar, and nutrient management. We also looked at a collection of pathways having to do with trees and agricultural lands, which provided a surprisingly large amount of potential. Over here, we have wetlands representing 20% of the potential. Avoided peatland conversion is a very big piece of that. Forests providing 15% of the potential. The improved forest management pathway is one of the biggest pathways, and embedded in that pathway are actually 3 distinct types of activities. They're setting aside old growth areas within the big active managed tenures on Crown lands. There's regenerative silviculture practices, and I always like to say basically helping young trees grow faster. And there's also shifting wood products from pulp and paper to longer lived wood products. So within that one pathway, there's also 3 different elements that really apply to the commercial forest sector. There's also restoration of tree cover, so tree planting, and avoiding avoiding conversion of other types of private forest lands. And also grasslands is a very big piece of the opportunity, especially with avoiding grassland conversion. And that is either native grasslands or grazing grasslands to like cover crops, or I'm sorry, like cash crops. So these numbers are all in that 2030 timeframe. What's very important too is we did project out the results out to the 2050 timeframe. And all of the tree planting pathways have very minimal impact in that 2030 timeframe. But when you look out to 2050, for example, restoration of tree cover alone is 25 megatons per year in the year 2050. And so one of our key takeaways from this study is that for Canada and this potential that we found, it's very critical that we be making investments in these actions that protect nature and avoid imminent emissions from entering the atmosphere, managing lands in different ways, like through cover crops and that regenerative silviculture practices, and then restoration. And we need to be making this investment across that spectrum now, because the protection is going to get its huge potential. It's 38% of the total potential in 2030. It's going to get us immediate emissions reductions now, as well as the manage. But the restoration, we need to be making those investments now if we're going to recoup the benefits in the 2050 timeframe. So that's a very important finding from this study for Canada. I mentioned the cost effectiveness, and so the study, like I said, looks at the mitigation potential at different price points. You can see that a huge part of the manage, which really is a lot of the actions that the forestry industry and agriculture industry can take, are available at less than $100 a ton, which is often kind of a make or break sort of threshold that people are looking at right now. And even restoration, half of that potential is less than $100 a ton. Protection's a little bit more expensive. A lot of the potential is available. You have only a quarter of the potential available at less than $100 a ton, but those pathways are going to get more expensive over time. Some of these other pathways, management pathways, could even get less expensive as new technology comes aboard. But those protection pathways are going to get more expensive the longer we wait, partly because of land value. And so while they may be more expensive when you compare them against the other ones now, they're good investments and those immediate reductions that we can get right now. So those are sort of the key headlines from the study. And when we get into the Q&A, I'm happy to answer questions about more specific pathways. I didn't want to walk you through all the nitty gritty. And of course, you can download the report. And if you go to our website, we have some really great infographics that help digest this very dense manuscript. But looking forward, we definitely see some key areas that we as a community, whether it's NGOs, the corporate sector, governments, need to be investing in to really get from this project by project space that we're kind of in right now and deploying these natural climate solutions to scalable solutions. So certainly there's more data gaps. There's kind of taking this analysis down to a more jurisdictional level, so municipalities can understand what it means for them. So there's definitely some of that. Really, in the big piece, which I think is very relevant to today's conversation, is the policy and markets. And so there's plenty of opportunities for developing government incentives that advance these, especially the management activities in agriculture and forest. There's investments for protection of lands that would also help Canada meet its protected area goals. And then there's also things that we need to do to help actually make investable markets. And so I think that's one of the things that we'll start talking about today. We also, personally, Nature United, a lot of our history has been supporting Indigenous-led conservation and economic development. As I mentioned, Indigenous people have a very important role to play in advancing these natural climate solutions in ways that align with their own land use visions and goals for economic development. And so that's certainly an area where my organization will continue to support, and we should all be thinking about. And just 2 more slides to transition to the discussion today. You know, when we think of Nature United, when we think of partnering with the corporate sector to advance these natural climate solutions, these are sort of the buckets that we think there's a role for corporate leadership. And so first is setting targets, and FPAC and Maple Leaf with us today have set ambitious targets. And so that's the first thing. Ambitious and science-based targets, and then actually the plans of how you're going to meet those targets. And then reducing emissions, and this is really what I hope we can get into today, is developing these strategies for reducing emissions. And so, of course, there's strategies for reducing scope 1 and 2 emissions, like within your own operations and things that are in your control. But as companies are also reducing those emissions from operations and things like that, then also looking at how you can deploy natural climate solutions within their own value chains of that business or that industry. And so things like demanding deforestation and conversion-free products, and using your sourcing policies to demand those types of products, and showing demand for carbon credits that are high quality, that have social and environmental benefits as well as greenhouse gas benefits, and also exploring new products. I think we'll talk about technology, and there's certainly, whether it's product shifting in the forest sector or technologies to support reducing barriers to natural climate solutions, there's new lines of business that can evolve here as well. And lastly, advocating for policy. My dream is that, working with companies like Maple Leaf and others who have set these targets, we then can advocate for smart policies, incentives that will really bring the rest of the industry along. And one more point on that is this great report that came out from World Economic Forum. The whole report's called Net Zero Challenge, and then there's a chapter on decarbonizing supply chains, a corporate guide. And this is brand new. It's out this year. So a really great report, I think, for anyone who hasn't read it yet, to understand, what this really means for decarbonizing supply chains and where some of the buckets of opportunity are. So with that, I will stop talking. And I do want to thank all of our supporters who have been, as a nonprofit, we're very reliant on our supporters who have been supporting this work for a number of years, and especially Metcalf Foundation, who's sponsored this event today. And I am done.
Thank you, Amanda. That was a very concise and information-packed summary of a huge amount of work that's been going on in this project over the last 3 years. What we're going to do now is start off the conversation with 3 experts that we've invited to join us this afternoon, and then we'll move into a broader Q&A with everybody who's online with us this afternoon. But you can enter questions at any time. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom for that, not the chat function. If you want to contact your buddy about getting together later in a private chat, that's fine. But please use the Q&A for questions that you would like the panelists to address, or perhaps that we'll be able to answer right in the Q&A space itself. So with that, we're going to move along to engage our panelists on this topic. It's really, when I was thinking about it, it seems like it's almost the business of biology. And we have 3 panelists who are all in biologically based business one way or another. 2 of them are actually biologists by training, which is interesting. And but they've all ended up either in forestry or in agriculture, or in thinking about nature-based solutions to climate change, focused on the business challenges and the business dimensions of writing or reestablishing a more sustainable relationship with the agricultural and the forest lands in particular, but with all of our primary productive ecosystems in Canada. The first panelist is Tim Faveri. I hope I've got the accent right, Tim. I meant to ask you ahead of time. Tim is one of those biologists. He is the joining us today from Maple Leaf, where he is the Vice President for Sustainability and Shared Value. He's been thinking and working on these issues for a very long time in a company that generates value with a huge dependence on natural productive systems. So this has been a central issue, I'm sure, for Maple Leaf for some time. And Tim, as Amanda said, Maple Leaf has set science-based targets that are aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement on climate change, ambitious targets. And I'm wondering how Maple Leaf, which is a company that has huge protein production and fiber needs in Canada, deploys natural climate solutions, and which pathways that we've heard presented here today fit into your value chain, and how would deploying these solutions affect your business? Where are the opportunities? Where are the challenges? What are the strategies going forward?
Sure, thanks, Ralph.
That's not too broad.
No, I think I can focus in. Just wanted to acknowledge Nature United and all the supporters of the research. I think it's vitally important that we get research like this out into the community, corporate Canada and around the world. It's super informative, and it's all groundbreaking. I'll tell you that right now. The concept of nature-based solutions really hit around the climate summit in 2019. That's the same year that we submitted and got our science-based GHG targets approved, and we became the world's first carbon neutral food company. Nature-based solutions at that time, prior to setting our targets, weren't part of our pathway approach, because we honestly didn't really even know a lot about them. But very quickly, NBS, or Natural Climate Solutions, have taken the forefold, and it's super exciting. It's probably one of the most talked about concepts and approaches to decarbonize supply chain emissions for food companies. So with that context, Maple Leaf, we're farm to fork on our animal protein business. That's pork and poultry. We've got science-based targets to reduce our Scope 1 and 2 emissions and our Scope 3 emissions. And when we look at our Scope 3 emissions, in fact, make up about 80% of our overall emissions, and that's pretty typical of large food industries. It gets very challenging. The food system is quite complex, and traceability is limited, particularly in grains and other commodities, right down to farm gates. So 1/3 of those emissions that are in our inventory are directly related to the feed grains that we procure to feed our animals, and as well to source as main ingredients to our plant-based protein business. So it's very important when you develop a science-based target that you really leverage the robust inventory that you create on greenhouse gases and focus where you can have the most impact. So all that being said, we've been working hard over the last couple of years. We've established a really good partnership with Indigo Agriculture that's working on regenerative agriculture practices, primarily in the United States right now. Those big regenerative ag practices of no-till and cover crops and crop rotation and grazing livestock, et cetera, and working with farmers to change their behavior and monetize the carbon that is sequestered in their soil. So essentially, the soil for every farmer becomes a carbon asset. The field is their asset. And through monetizing a carbon credit for a company like Maple Leaf, who is looking for regenerative agriculture, nature-based solution offsets to procure, that becomes a really important relationship. That's one example. We're also working much closer to home. It was announced yesterday by a great partner of ours, Nutrien, in Saskatchewan. We've entered into a partnership to pilot work on regenerative agriculture practices within Canadian supply chains. And this is super important because, as I've said, this is also new. The world is still looking to develop the accounting standards for nature-based solutions and regenerative agriculture practices to allow companies like Maple Leaf and Nutrien and others up and down a very large and complex supply chain to properly account for emissions reductions or removals that we can influence. That doesn't exist yet, right? And so to make progress and report against our science-based targets, we're going to need an accounting standard to be able to do that. So by doing this pilot work in Canada and leveraging some existing agricultural protocols, much aligned with Nature United's research, it's setting the stage for independent certifiers of these programs to allow and build the accounting standards for companies like Maple Leaf and Nutrien and others up and down the value chain to actually share in the claims that can be made for our interventions when we're working. But most important is that the farmer gets put front and center and can be rewarded for the practices that they undertake on farm. So those are kind of a couple of examples. Like I tell you, it's brand new. It's innovative. We look all the time and look very critically at offsets that we're purchasing. We purchase forestry offsets aligned to nature-based solutions, and as well as much as we can with respect to agriculture. This is growing. This is an emerging space. So we push for certification and now working in the supply chain to help build that out for the food system moving forward. So it's very important to get all those factors out on the table and debate and discuss and standardize.
When you're looking at the business case for some of these solutions, what difference does the carbon price make in the way the analysis comes out? And is the price that we're looking forward to here in Canada at $170 a ton, is that making a big difference, or does it need to be higher? Or are you finding solutions that actually you can make a business case for almost independent of the carbon price in question?
We're actually doing that independently right now because we're a carbon neutral company. We've set an internal price on carbon independent of the regulatory price. That gives us control. We understand and appreciate that, it's kind of a patchwork quilt in Canada right now with respect to carbon price. And if we're going to be investing capital dollars, we want to minimize the risk, regulatory risk, stroke of the pen risk per se, of governments changing and wiping out carbon price and carbon markets. So right now, anyway, we focus on our internal price, and we are seeing that by having that internal price of carbon, capital decisions that we make can be that cost reduction of us sourcing offsets goes directly to the return on investment on our capital projects, and we're seeing a lot of them become very favorable return on investments because of that. That's our lens. That's the way we're doing it. But certainly, more broadly, I would like to see more standardized pricing across regional jurisdictions across Canada, so that farmers and landowners of forests can be compensated equally across the country, as opposed to different values across different regions.
Okay, well, we may find that issue comes up again before the hour runs its course, but I want to move on to our other panelists so we can get everybody in here. Next is Kate Lindsay, who's with the Forest Products Association of Canada, where she is the Senior Vice President and also a biologist by training, if I got my research right, which I hope I do. I am a director of research. And obviously, the forest products industry in this country has gone through tremendous change in the last 10, 15 years. And it'll be interesting to hear your perspective on how that interacts with the issue of the forest land role that the role that forest lands play in our climate mitigation efforts. The Forest Products Association has been a consistent supporter of Canada's climate ambitions. And I guess I'm wondering, like, what at this point in the evolution of the forest industry in a country which in many ways, in many parts of it, was built up around logging and forestry activities. What's the business case looking forward for the forest sector to contribute to natural climate solutions? And how can the forest industry advance some of the pathways that are described in this study, such as better utilization of wood waste, improved forest management, and shifting to the longer lived products, setting aside of old growth areas and so on? I mean, there's a lot in here for the forestry industry. And so, Kate, over to you.
Thank you, Ralph. I also just want to acknowledge this great work from Nature United, and particularly Amanda's work and Dr. Ronnie Drever as well. And yeah, excited to be here and talk about it. The forest sector, and in particular FPAC, the organization I work for, has long been active on climate change mitigation and supporting carbon reductions, including natural solutions. I think the study from TNC globally and Nature United has helped to bring a common language to some of these solutions, which is really helpful. I want to recognize that in 2018, the United Nations at COP24 recognized the significant role of forests and forest products in reaching the Paris Agreement goals. And at FPAC too, after the Paris Climate Agreement was signed in 2016, we put forth a challenge for the sector to further mitigate both removals, so increased sequestration and emission reductions through our value chain of 30 megatons by 2030. We're working really hard right now to get out a report on that, on progress made in different areas, as well as positioning it with the emerging language on net zero by 2050 and how we can contribute to Canada's net zero targets by 2050, recognizing that the forest sector can provide solutions to other sectors as well to decarbonize. So I just want to go through some of the places that we have made progress on and where we're excited to do more. And also to say that our challenge was really built on some of the excellent work from the Canadian Forest Service. So some of the scientists that are tracking and measuring and accounting for carbon sequestered through forestry and land use change. And some of those are the same scientists that collaborated on this Nature United report. So just great to see that alignment. So a lot of the pathways that came out of this report are things and ideas that we've already been incorporating and tracking progress on. So some of the, also just to say, the GHG emission reductions have happened. I see that as a little bit outside the nature-based climate solutions, but our sector has made reductions of 66% of greenhouse gas emissions from facilities since 1990. And so there's still progress to be made, but want to recognize some early leadership there. But some of the most promising pathways for further improvements in the forest sector value chain are within the forests and the use of forest products or wood products moving forward. And so I'm going to focus a little bit on those two pathways, as kind of Amanda highlighted at the beginning. So when we talk about forests, some of those are improved forest management, increased utilization, and then also when we use forest-based products particularly instead of a fossil fuel derived product, it's referred to as displacement or substitution benefits. And so those can be significant. Want to recognize that we look at this in a systems approach, similar to the way that the Canadian government looks at it for forestry. So it's removals, emission reductions, as well as storage of carbon through the multiple value chains. So in the forest, one of the opportunities that highlighted in this report that we're also quite focused on is referred to as increased utilization, which is essentially using more of the wood residue that would otherwise be left behind or burned. So we want to make sure that we can optimize that forest residue, and it can be used to reduce emissions. So bioenergy can be used, which would displace fossil fuel, and a lot of that's been happening in the forest sector already. But this can be done, as mentioned, to help other sectors decarbonize, particularly the steel and cement industry that use a lot of energy. And then the other area I want to speak to is enhanced growth and yield in the forest sector, as well as climate smart forestry. I know that the term improved forest management has been, somewhat associated with the carbon side of things. We're starting to use the term climate smart forestry. It includes concepts of improved forest management, but also speaks to essentially sequestering more land-based carbon while also building resiliency into the forest to maintain forest health into the future. So this includes addressing climate vulnerabilities. We know forest pests and increased wildland fire need to be addressed in Canada, as well as silvicultural innovation that can help trees store more carbon into the future. Another area that I want to speak to that might be a bit counterintuitive, but the forest sector works really hard to sequester carbon in wetlands. So we partner with Ducks Unlimited Canada in particular over a couple of decades to manage wetlands. So, map them, classify them, know where they are so they can go into our forest management plans. And then also we're building knowledge to quantify the carbon sequestered in those wetlands. So really exciting work that is, I think, really leading edge to be able to quantify and understand the carbon benefits through sustainable forest management that conserve wetlands. And then the last thing I want to speak to is wood products. So we know that carbon storing benefits of wood are significant, and it's obvious, but if those benefits are in products that are used for longer, so they're not, they have a much longer half-life, then the carbon is locked in and sequestered in those products for longer. So we do see an opportunity to shift the product mix in Canada and how we export products as well. So carbon can be maintained in particularly those building products moving forward, and lots of exciting developments in mass timber. And then don't want to forget that there's opportunities again in that substitution space. So where wood-based bioproducts can be used to displace fossil fuel derived products, that's a carbon benefit. And we know that there's lots of exciting developments in the bioeconomy space, whether it's biofuels, whether it's wood fiber being used. For instance, lignin, which is a byproduct of pulping, can be used as a glue or a resin to displace fossil fuel derived products. And then of course, as an alternative to single-use plastic moving forward. So lots of co-benefits there. And I will stop there. Just one other thing, actually, when Amanda mentioned at the beginning, knowing that forestry in Canada is done sustainably right now. So all of our members need to be certified to one of 3 third-party certification standards. And these standards do ensure that there's no conversion of forests. So all forests that are managed for wood and wood products are regenerated, and that and those standards are evolving to meet social needs, whether they're now wanting to account for climate vulnerabilities and climate smart forestry moving forward as well. So just to say that there's also some of those checks and balances in place already on making sure that forestry is done sustainably moving forward. So thanks, Ralph, and thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, Kate. I have lots of questions follow up that I could get into, but I've let the schedule slip a little bit, so I'm going to move on, if you don't mind, to Bill Morris, our third panelist with us this afternoon. And Bill had a long career with Accenture Canada, so he knows a lot about many different types of businesses and is experienced with Canada's major industries. And as I understand it, has a passionate interest in the business case for these natural climate solutions and has made that a central focus in what he's been doing recently. So, Bill, with this study in mind, what do you see as the most urgent and business positive opportunities for the private sector to be advancing these pathways?
Well, thanks, Ralph, and also like to acknowledge Amanda's and Ronnie's outstanding work with this amazing study. And Ralph, your study, your prior study as well with Corporate Knights on broader beyond nature pathways for Canada. If you look at this study, and if you dig into it, 24 odd climate solutions at a granular level of 10 provinces and a number of territories. And then actually dig further and go into the supplementary materials. It's a hugely rich data set. And if you could imagine overlaying on that data set, the LiDAR and radar and optical imagery data sets and the property ownership data sets that are out there today, that take you down to a 3-meter 3D resolution. Imagine what you could do to pinpoint where the real opportunities are for these nature-based solutions. And, I look at that at one hand and say, okay, the Nature United team has pointed there's ample opportunity here. And certainly all of what we read and know, there's lots of demand being created by the net zero movement. The demand side looks great. And lots of discussion and talk on the finance side as well. But I think the big challenge actually is the supply side. Taking that data, that rich data, and then realizing that what we're talking about is coming up with projects with individual landowners, working with Indigenous communities, working with the industries, the working land industries, the main ones we have represented here with Kate and Tim, forestry and agriculture, to come up with projects that are credible in the marketplace today. That's the big challenge that I see. Obviously, big opportunity. I'm spending some of my time working with the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and we've just started up what we call the Nature plus Climate Projects Accelerator. And the idea is to accelerate projects, to solicit ideas and to pick the best of them and give them the support, the financing, the push to turn them into real credible projects that will be embraced by the marketplace. But we really need so much more on top of that. And I think, as in terms of Ralph further, what the private sector can do, the working lands is such a huge part of Canada and the set of solutions that Amanda presented, and the collaboration represented by Kate and Tim here today. These industries collaborating with others, their customers. I think it was Kate who said that there's an opportunity here, both as the forest products producers for their own value chain reductions, but emissions reductions, but also as a supplier of emission reductions in partnership with other industries. So the need for collaboration in these working land industries, I think, is a huge opportunity. And maybe the last thing I'll say, which might prompt some other questions, is my advice generally is don't get thrown off by the concerns that are out there in this emerging market today. This is an emerging market. It's growing. It's imperfect. It's evolving. You just look at in the last 12 months, the Task Force for Scaling the Voluntary Carbon Markets, the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosures, the just announced and launched today Task Force for Nature Disclosures, what Vera and the Canadian offset system are doing to reflect in all the learnings, the innovations that are happening in the marketplace. This market is moving, and just proceed forward at taking the high road and develop and or fund credible projects. The price is only going one way but up. And I think that will help us do what we all dream about, which is to give a value of nature that really hasn't happened in the past.
Well, thank you, Bill. it seems like there's a race against time in some ways, that this market is growing, but climate change is advancing at the same time. And I wonder what your thoughts are when you look at those two lines, and whether we can get to the kinds of targets that are being set for the year 2030, for example. Is this market growing with that kind of momentum? And if not, how do we accelerate these collaborations, which you say are going to be essential to that growth?
Well, the market's certainly surprised me in the last year in terms of the steam that it's picked up, and then the stimulus of, in Canada, the carbon price and the offset market that's being put in place, and all the net zero commitments. Can we scale the supply? I mean, that's the big challenge that we have. We're a country of nature. If we can't do it, then others won't be able to. I'm an optimist, though.
Okay. So we've had a number of questions that are coming in the Q&A. Some of them we've been able to field directly. We've got time to put a few of them to the panelists. One states that the analysis shows that actions on agricultural lands seem to be really where the biggest opportunities are. And looking at the challenges and the benefits, is action on agriculture, is it really the biggest opportunity where the greatest gains can be made soonest? And I guess that would be directed perhaps towards, well, who wants to pick that up? I'm not sure. Would that be something you'd like to talk about, Tim, or anyone else on the panel? The question is basically, is agriculture really where the biggest opportunity is?
I'll certainly provide some input, and perhaps Amanda can talk to some of the data in the report. But for agriculture, we're dealing with annual crop cycles, and already depleted soils, for example, in regions that aren't aligned or haven't embraced a lot of regenerative techniques. So there's lots of opportunity, I think, as Amanda mentioned, on cover crops and other regenerative agriculture practices. The comparison with forests, which is equally important, and as the study provided, is this is kind of future-proofing by tree planting, because of the sequestration that happens over longer periods of time. But I do think low-hanging fruit, in our eyes anyway, is regenerative agriculture.
I'm curious also, and there's been some questions about this changing product mix in the forestry sector, Kate, and the extent to which the growth in mass timber, for example, that you made reference to, and other forest-based products substituting for fossil fuel-based products, and the potential, I guess, for the bioeconomy to emerge as a new way of developing value from our primary forest productivity. Could you say a little bit more about that? There seems to be a lot of interest in the extent to which the future forest industry in Canada will be about something different than the pulp and paper that dominated its business in the historical period.
Absolutely, yeah. So one of some of the models that were used, I mean, they look at carbon stored in products and then when it's emitted to the atmosphere. And so obviously, if it's in more products that are intended to be used for much longer, then that carbon sequestration is taking place. And so building materials has always been one. But the innovation in mass timber has been, well, it's really exciting, to be honest. It was very much started in Europe and Austria in particular. And so we were waiting to see when would that technology innovation start to take place in Canada. So, and it requires a lot of changes. It requires building code changes to allow for building tall buildings. So you have, you have a demand for those products here in North America, and that started to happen, particularly in the Pacific Northwest. And then also architects and builders knowing how to use those products, and then sourcing them here in Canada. Now we've got 4 facilities in Canada that make mass timber in Quebec, in Alberta, and British Columbia right now. And so it's just really exciting to see. They're also beautiful buildings. So people enjoy the aesthetic value of seeing these wooden beams that are intended to be there for a long time and storing carbon. And of course, displacing carbon that would have otherwise gone into the product development, you know, whether it would have been concrete or steel. So although there's definitely a need for multiple or materials moving forward, but we like to see the carbon sequestered in buildings. So cities are going to be storing carbon. There's going to be wooden cities moving forward, which is so exciting. And then we really do want to move towards value-added products instead of volume-based forest management. And so that really incentivizes companies to make use. And I think an increasing carbon price is going to help that as well. There's going to be a need to use those wooden residues and put them into other value-added products. And again, that displacement opportunity. So anyway, just we see a lot of it, and part of it is the innovation. It's the investment in those new technologies. It's commercialization. And as the government right now is looking at funding, that innovation, is making sure that those funding programs are accessible to some of this exciting forest innovation technology moving forward. I can keep going,
really
Ralph,
depend on. Yeah, I can imagine. I know that it's going to be a challenge, I would think, to develop applications for the lower quality residue materials that maybe at one time would have been taken by pulp mills, but for which the demand is declining for that purpose. And it's the higher value added products presumably require smaller volumes of material in the first place. And so it's going to be a challenge, I suppose, to balance the nature of a tree from the emerging market for products that one can extract from the materials in a tree. But
yeah, and we're seeing
be the subject for a whole other webinar.
Exactly. So anyway, lots of support for, I think moving forward, de-risking some of those, that innovative commercialization and whether the demand before you make that investment. So anyway, lots of space for discussion in the future.
There's a question, we have a little bit of time, not too much. There's a question about how Indigenous communities are being engaged and consulted in the development and implementation of these natural climate solutions. I don't know if you'd like to address that, Amanda, or if any of the panelists might have a particular insight on that question to offer.
Well, I'll start by saying, as we've been putting this study together, we've really been advocating to the federal government that they should be investing in natural climate solutions as part of the larger initiatives to get to net zero and reach the 2030 targets. And as part of that advocacy, we've absolutely been advocating that Indigenous rights need to be considered first. And that Indigenous people need a role at the tables at the very beginning as we're looking at what solutions are viable and appropriate, and making that space. So, and I think the federal government has been doing a pretty good job about that, as it's been starting to make these funding commitments and to launch these programs. There's certainly continued areas for improvement. The federal offset program protocol would be an example where you see Indigenous engagement being embedded in that protocol, and it's certainly very critical. Yeah, I don't know if one of the others want to say how their companies have been, or organizations have also been engaging Indigenous people.
I might just say one really important area is adaptation planning moving forward. And we know it's really important to many of the Indigenous peoples and Indigenous owned forest management companies that we engage with, that there's an opportunity to build, to have healthy and resilient forests into the future. And sometimes that means managing them differently, whether it's more diverse tree species, whether it's doing some fire smart at a landscape scale. So to avoid communities being evacuated because of wildland fire in the future. And then there's some great programs actually out of NRCan, the Indigenous Forestry Initiative, which is helping to build capacity so Indigenous communities can use biomass where it's available to get off of diesel in remote communities. So lots of examples and lots of opportunity to do more as well, but agree that it's absolutely important to engage with Indigenous peoples in the places that they live and work. So.
Okay, we're almost out of time. I thought we'd wrap up with a rapid fire set of answers to the question, what next? We've got this huge study on the table with all of these wonderful opportunities that add up to a significant contribution to mitigating climate change. What's the single thing that comes to the top of mind for getting these opportunities in place? And we're going to end with Amanda, but we'll start with Tim.
Wow, this wasn't in the rehearsal.
No.
But good question. Right off the top of my head, I guess I would like to see more corporates getting involved in setting ambitious climate goals, science-based targets.
Okay. Kate?
I would just
on the spot.
No problem. I would just encourage action now. I think the point that Tim made also where forestry solutions are going to be realized the most is post 2030, because it takes time to grow these adapted forests and to store more carbon. But just to say, the sooner we start doing that, the more benefits we can realize into the future.
Bill?
Yeah, I think that these two guys, Tim and Kate, got it. One is start with science-based targets. That's what all the corporates need to do. That's job one. Reduce your own emissions first. And then secondly, scale the supply.
Right. And Amanda, back to you where we started. How does Nature United and you personally see the path forward now that you've got this thing out there?
Well, partnerships is my title. So collaboration and public-private partnerships, especially of those focusing on what are those barriers of implementation, or Kate talked about de-risking innovation. And so how can the public and private sectors work together to incentivize these actions and take some of the risks off of our early actors?
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the people who took an hour to join us for this conversation. And thank you especially to our panelists, all very busy people who have taken the time to contribute their insights over the past hour. The nature-based solutions has been a central focus of the Corporate Knights overall coverage and research on the question of how we can build back better after the pandemic in a way that will respond to the climate crisis. So this will watch this space. This will not be our last session that deals with these nature-based solutions. And we look forward to having you join us in the future for the many other Corporate Knights events that you will see notices for in the coming weeks and months around the question of climate mitigation generally and natural solutions in particular. So thank you again, everybody. It's 2:00, so time is up. The sand has run through the hourglass over my shoulder here, but we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much, Ralph and Corporate Knights and Metcalf Foundation. Great.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.